Hi, everyone. I'm Zeta Sorrell Medina, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Irvine, in the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy. And my research dissertation focuses on broadly measuring the impact of nonprofits in the US, in addition to measuring immigrant inclusion and exclusion outcomes. And I broadly look at the interrelations between how immigrant-serving nonprofits contribute to immigrant inclusion outcomes in the US. So what I'm going to be doing in the next half hour or so, I'm going to be presenting on one of my studies that focuses on the goals of the US immigrant-serving nonprofit sector. And one of my hopes for this presentation is for both researchers and practitioners. One of the takeaways that I hope to communicate is how this information can be useful for policy and practice. Essentially, knowing the goals of the sector, of the US immigrant-serving nonprofit sector, can be useful for strategic planning and decision making. So I will share my screen right now. Okay. So what my research, the research question for this presentation is, what are the goals of the US immigrant-serving nonprofit sector? So this is a national study that I launched a few months ago, and the aim is to understand, well, what is it that organizations are doing out in the field? What are their goals? What are their aims? I hypothesized that probably the main goal of organizations is to contribute to immigrant inclusion outcomes. And this hypothesis is rooted in the literature and history. One of the points I want to illustrate here is the fact that immigrants have historically been excluded from US society. And one of the reasons why organizations form is to combat exclusion. And so with that, it's reasonable, therefore, to expect that to promote immigrant inclusion would be the primary goal of immigrant-serving nonprofits. And when I say inclusion, I'm really referring to the process through immigrants, the process through which immigrants are included in society. And this is exemplified through the, for example, acquisition of rights, legalization, and cultural acceptance. So essentially, there are many different types of inclusion, and organizations, immigrant-serving nonprofits, have primarily been concerned with promoting different kinds of inclusion for immigrant groups in the US. So how do I answer this research question? I first identify my target population, which happens to be US immigrant-serving nonprofits with a 501c3 status. An immigrant-serving nonprofit here is defined as an organization that serves, advocates for immigrants, or promote their cultural heritage. The methods I use for this study is quantitative content analysis of organizational web pages combined with interviews with practitioners between October to December 2020. I interviewed 29 practitioners throughout the US, throughout many US cities. And my sample for my webpage data is from a national random representative sample. And the reason why I choose this method is because essentially I want to be able to draw inferences to the population of nonprofits. I want to be able to say that the main goal of US immigrant-serving nonprofits is this, or this. And I want to be able to say that with a level of confidence. So I therefore choose random sampling, which allows for extrapolations to a population. The interviews I conduct is with practitioners throughout US cities, and both samples, the interviews and the web page analysis, allow for triangulation and data which is basically data verification. So here are my findings. The first finding is that from the national random sample, the hypothesis is confirmed. The main goal of US immigrant-serving nonprofits is to promote immigrant inclusion. And in this sample of webpage, so what I did was I analyzed the mission statements of about 130 organizations. I identified 29 goals that are operating in the organizational field. So here are the goals of the US immigrant-serving nonprofit sector. So you can see, I'm just going to show, we're going to just look at this to the right, which is the goals relative to one another. So as you can see here, promoting immigrant culture and history represents a very salient goal among organizations. You can see that 37, it's a goal that's expressed by 37% of organizations. And the next is providing services to immigrants. And following that, we see that another popular goal is to promote, promote intergroup bonding. That's 5%, promote intergroup bonding among immigrants. So these represent the goals relative to one another. The column to the left here represents the overall goal expressed across all goals. So again, we can see the same trend happening. A lot of organizations are concerned with promoting immigrant culture and history, as well as providing services to immigrants. You can see here that providing services represents 21% of the goals expressed, and promoting immigrant culture represents 24 or 64. So these two may be a little bit confusing to understand, but essentially they're just two different ways to represent the data, and they're both saying the same thing, which is that promoting immigrant culture and history and providing services to immigrants are very popular goals. But there are some goals that are not as popular. So for example, we have propagating religion, not so popular. We have providing legal services, not so popular. We also have ending violence among the immigrant community that represents less than 1% of all the goals of the US immigrant-serving nonprofit sector. Okay. Here's some other findings. So that was the findings for the webpage data. I'm going to now present the data, the findings for the interviews, what I found in the 29 interviews, which is less generalizable, but nevertheless is still important to review. So in the interview sample, I found that 35 goals were identified. 10 of these goals overlap with the webpage data, which basically confirms that provides some data validation. And also, I also look at, well, okay, there's so many goals. What are these goals? How are these goals conceptually related to immigrant inclusion? And what I find is that of the 53 goals identified total in both samples, 75% of the goals, again, is concerned with 75% is concerned with promoting inclusion. So what does this mean? Most of the goals are concerned with promoting inclusion. And let's go a little bit deeper and examine, well, what kind of inclusion. 48% touch upon 48%. Oh, that's actually wrong. I apologize for that. So actually it's 48% touch upon cultural inclusion, and then 28% touch upon rights inclusion, and 25% legal inclusion. So again, what we're seeing is this pattern where we have a lot of organizations that are concerned with promoting immigrant cultural and history and preserving culture over representing immigrant rights and legalization, which is very interesting. So folks watching this might wonder, well, in my city, there's a lot of organizations that are actually not cultural organizations. Maybe you live in a city where lots of organizations are doing advocacy. And my response to that is, again, this is a national representative sample. So I don't necessarily look at one particular city. If you look at one city, such as, if you compare, for example, what orgs are doing in Los Angeles, it's going to look completely different than what orgs are doing in Detroit, for example. So rather than looking at each individual city alone, which would be, not conducive to this study, I look at the national sample to see what organizations are doing in the aggregate. So in the aggregate, the trend is that organizations are mostly concerned with promoting immigrant cultural inclusion, which is very interesting. If anyone attended my presentation in yesterday, I talked a little bit about this. I talked about how organizations are, or cities, cities in the US, in Florida, cities in Florida are also similarly concerned with promoting culture, immigrant culture, preservation, etc., over immigrant rights and legalization. So we see a very interesting trend. We see this dynamic playing out whereby organizations in the US are concerned with mainly promoting culture and history. And likewise, local governments are in Florida are also concerned with mostly the same approach to inclusion. So that's just something, that's just food for thought to think about. Why is it that we don't have as many organizations that are promoting immigrant legalization and in the US and in their rights? Why is it? So my study doesn't necessarily touch upon that, but I can definitely speak to it, and just noting that when we think about inclusion as a process, which is what I talk about yesterday a lot in my presentation, we can go from it can, on one hand, it can be circular. So we can think of it as not as something that's binary, whereby you have you're either you're included or not included. No, it doesn't necessarily work like that. We think about it as being a process, and we can think of historical examples of immigrant groups and minority groups where we had to go through first recognizing that this group of people are humans, right? This group of people are have value in society, and so we begin with recognizing that a particular group in the populace are valuable members in the political community, and then that form of inclusion then goes to the acquisition of rights and legalization. And we're constantly fighting for inclusion. Even once we obtain citizenship, we are still constantly fighting. Some immigrant groups and minority groups we are still constantly fighting for inclusion. And so the takeaway for this slide that I want to illustrate essentially is that we need to kind of think about, well, for at least the nonprofit sector, what can we do to broaden the different ways that we are enacting inclusion measures? So yes, it's important for the community to celebrate immigrant culture or a particular culture. It's also important to preserve culture, to preserve language. It's also important to exhibit the different cultural manifestations in the community. It's important to display. And that's important because it allows for the community to appreciate and to celebrate diversity. So then what next? Can we now move from that stage to the next stage, which would be to, okay, well, how can we ensure the political representation of different groups in the community? Can we go from cultural acceptance and appreciation to political representation and acceptance? Okay, so this next slide represents the interview sample. And in this sample, you can see basically the same thing from the other slide. This slide here illustrates what organizations are doing, the 29, so it's quite limited to the 29 organizations that I sample. And I interviewed individuals from in different places, California, Memphis, New York. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily random. It is not random, but it is very quite heterogeneous. And with this heterogeneous sample, it's more generalizable than a homogeneous sample. So I'm quite confident that even though there's only 29 folks who I interviewed, we can look at this and conclude that it has some degree of generalizability. So the first thing I want to point out in this slide is the most salient goals. So we're going to look first here, left column. So the most salient goals expressed in this sample is providing services to immigrants, so 22%. And then providing legal services represents 19%. And community education on immigrant topics represents 19%. So again, we're seeing the same trend. Even in the interview data, we're seeing a trend where rights and legalization doesn't necessarily represent an important goal of the sector, but we do see that services are very important. Legal services also, that also includes legal services, and then community education. And that's this. One of the things I want to point out in this slide is when we think about social change efforts, we think about, well, what are some effective ways to promote immigrant inclusion? Services are very important. Services are very important to ensure that community has their basic needs. Legal services are also important for immigration related concerns. Community education is also important because it helps to disabuse negative stereotypes of immigrant groups. It helps to ensure that the community has the information that they need to make the decisions to ensure that they are living optimally. One thing I would like to propose for the audience is how to come to think about this. How do we begin to think about this array of goals? And there is, if any of y'all are familiar with the work of Irene Young, she talks about, she's a researcher, and she talks about the distributive and non-distributive modes of social justice. And essentially, the distributive mode refers to how we enact social change efforts that are essentially providing, giving goods to individuals. So it's essentially providing goods. Okay, so that's one mode of social justice. That's one way that social justice occurs, is through giving through giving goods. But then you have this other mode that is non-distributive, which refers to changing institution practices. And through these modes, we can then begin to see a change in culture, right? So it's rather than, providing goods, it's, just giving things to people to level the playing field. This mode of social justice refers to actually changing the ways that the practices manifest. It's changing institution, it's changing culture, it's changing the way that we see and the way that we practice. And I'm going to just take this idea and apply it to this framework to help understand these goals. So one way that I would like to present these goals is through this framework. And we can think of, for example, there's quite a number of goals here that are essentially in this framework of distribution, where we're providing services, right? We're providing services, but then we have goals that are less on the changing the way that we think, right? So that would be the community education. So with that, I just want to leave a takeaway. And when you're looking at this, and I can also share this information for folks who are interested. When we're thinking about the goals of the sector, essentially they manifest in many ways. And when we think about inclusion, there's many ways that that organizations achieve inclusion. And it's interesting because what this study shows is that organizations are chiefly concerned with modes of inclusion that kind of geared towards the end of basically providing services rather than really changing the culture and the way that we are operating as a society and treating immigrants. So okay. So now I want to conclude with a few implications for policy and practice. So, well, first, I hope that this study provides some sort of useful information for local governments and nonprofit practitioners. Essentially, we know that there's a lot of work that still needs to get done. And whenever there's a need in the community, we respond to that need. And there's a lot of organizations, I spoke to a lot of organizations, and they're doing, a lot of organizations are doing awesome jobs in ensuring that the community needs are being met and stopping harmful policies that affect immigrants and working tirelessly to combat negative forms of discrimination with ICE and the local government. And so many measures are essentially just out there everywhere. And we don't necessarily get to see it all the time. We don't get to see the work that folks are doing out in the community. But we know that there is work that is being done, and that I just want to take the time to acknowledge that, because there are a lot of things that are happening across the US, a lot of communities, a lot of exclusion. And it's essentially the role of the US immigrant-serving nonprofit sector. And it has always been the role since since the beginning of time. It's always been the role of organizations that service immigrants to ensure that immigrants are not being are basically standing up and representing the voice of the immigrant community. We can look all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, when Chinese orgs were being formed during the late 19th century. Again, organizations even during that time period was also forming to combat these negative tropes of Chinese immigrants, and to ensure that their voices were being heard. And over again throughout history, we see immigrants being excluded in associational living. And again, we see immigrant-serving organizations emerging to provide services to immigrants, since immigrants have been, for the most part, to be excluded throughout basically every many different dimensions and facets of U.S. life. And so, with looking at the goals of the sector, my aim here is to share some valuable information that can potentially help with long-term strategic planning. So if we know that, okay, well, this is what orgs are doing in the aggregate in the US, not necessarily in your particular city, which might be also useful to examine, but unfortunately, that's one limitation of this study, is that I don't look at what orgs are doing in one particular city, but rather the US as a whole. Nevertheless, this compilation of goals helps to understand what folks are doing across the US, which might be very useful for starting new programs, services, and initiatives. For instance, this study reveals that there are some goals in the sector that are unpopular, such as enhancing immigrant self-determination, uniting immigrant families, ending violence among the immigrant community, and enhancing foreign relations between the US and another country. So those are just 4, but there's quite a few of them that are goals that are not necessarily popular, but doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a need for ending, for example, violence among the immigrant community. And all of these goals, essentially, all of these interventions contribute in the aggregate to this overall canvas of inclusion. So if we know that, for example, we are performing one type of inclusion at this end of the spectrum, we might have another organization that's promoting inclusion on this end of the spectrum. And so what we have then is a holistic approach of promoting inclusion. If we see that there is a wide range of goals that are being that are being expressed, but we don't actually see that. And that's another story for that's another study for another day, but we don't actually see that. What we see, what we actually see in the US, in many cities, we actually see that organizations are actually replicating what other organizations are doing in the city. We see that there's this isomorphism effect happening, where what one organization does tends to replicate, and that's why you might have some cities where I remember talking to one organization who mentioned that they tried to enact some this radical approach to I forget what it was precisely, but it just didn't fly. It just didn't fly. It didn't fly in the city, and I think it was a city in Florida. It just didn't fly, and so the approach needed to essentially change. And then when the framing changed, the community was more accepting of the what the organization was doing. And so then what we see here across the US, across many cities, is this effect where it may be hard for some organizations to do something that completely deviates from what other organizations are doing. It might be perceived as radical. Folks may not want to partner with you. And then that kind of stagnates the growth of, it doesn't necessarily provide a fruitful opportunity for inclusion to manifest holistically if we're, essentially stuck on this, doing the same thing. So with this, I invite brave souls out there to consider some of these goals, even if it might deviate from what other organizations are doing in your community. These are needs that, these are goals that are not popular, but it doesn't necessarily imply that it's not a need in the community. And that concludes my presentation. I want to thank you all for your time and for listening. And if you would like me to share this study with you, you can email me at zetasm@uci.edu.
Thank you so much, Zeta.